Before dawn, a man steps out of his door. The street is empty. The air is cold. His boots press into the mud as he walks toward the center of town. No one greets him. A woman crossing the road sees him and stops. She turns. She walks the other way. A merchant setting up his stall looks up, then looks down again, quickly, as though eye contact alone could carry contamination. In the Middle Ages, there was one man everyone feared, but almost no one truly wanted to become. He could not live like other men. He could not walk through town unnoticed. In some places, even touching him was enough to make others recoil. He carried out the law but lived like an outcast, paid by the state, hated by the crowd. This was what life was really like for an executioner in the Middle Ages. This is not a video about punishment. It is a video about the man who carried it out and what that did to his life. We are going to follow the executioner from his home to the public square and back again. We will look at how he was chosen, what his days actually looked like, how people treated him, how his family suffered, and what it meant to live as the most necessary and most despised man in any medieval town. We will explore the silence that followed him through markets, the doors that closed when he approached, the weight of being associated with something that everyone demanded, but no one wanted to witness up close. And by the end, you may find that the darkest part of this job was not what he did in the square. It was what he had to live with afterward. Every medieval town of any significant size had one. He was not a soldier. He was not a criminal. He was a civic official, appointed, paid, and authorized by the local government or feudal lord to carry out sentences of public justice. And yet he lived as though he were cursed. The executioner occupied a position in medieval society that has almost no modern equivalent. He was essential. Courts passed sentences. Judges declared guilt. But someone had to carry out the physical reality of those sentences. Someone had to stand in front of the crowd, in front of the condemned, and perform the duty that the entire system depended on. That someone was the executioner. And in return for performing this duty, society treated him as contaminated. He was not merely disliked, he was shunned. In many German-speaking regions, the executioner was classified among the unehrliche Leute, the dishonorable people. This was not an insult. It was a legal and social category. It meant he could not join a guild. He could not hold civic office. He could not testify in certain courts. His word carried less weight than that of an ordinary citizen, even though his work was done on behalf of the law itself. In some towns, he was required to live outside the walls or on a specific street at the margin of the settlement. In others, he was given a house, but the house itself became a mark. Everyone knew where the executioner lived. Everyone avoided that door. Could he marry normally? Did people allow him near their homes? Was he feared more than hated? Did his children inherit the same fate? These are the questions that make this story far larger than a single profession. Because the executioner was not just a man with a job. He was a mirror held up to medieval society, reflecting everything that people needed done but refused to accept as part of their own world. No boy in a medieval town grew up dreaming of becoming the executioner. There was no guild of aspiring hangmen, no school for this work, no father who told his son, with pride, that one day he would stand in the public square and carry out the law's final word. And yet, executioners existed in nearly every significant town across medieval Europe. So, how did they come to hold this role? The answer is rarely simple and almost never voluntary, at least not in the way we understand choice. The most common path was inheritance. In many regions, particularly across the Holy Roman Empire, where the role was most thoroughly documented, the position of executioner passed from father to son. Not because the son wanted it, but because no one else would take it. The social contamination that attached to the executioner extended to his entire family. His children were already marked. They were already excluded from guilds, from certain marriages, from the social fabric of ordinary life. The son of an executioner had very few doors open to him, and the one door that was always open was the one his father had walked through. This created dynasties of executioners, families who held the position for generations, not out of ambition, but out of the absence of alternatives. In parts of Germany and Switzerland, certain family names became synonymous with the office. The Sanson family in France would later become perhaps the most famous example, serving as executioners of Paris across multiple generations into the era of the Revolution. But even in earlier centuries, the pattern was the same. The role trapped families inside itself. For those who were not born into it, the path was often desperation. A man facing severe poverty. A convicted criminal offered a reduction in sentence. A soldier returning from war with no trade, no land, and no prospects. A stranger in a town where no one knew his name and no one would miss him if the role consumed his reputation. Some towns struggled to find anyone willing to take the position. Records from medieval German cities describe prolonged vacancies where the office of executioner sat empty because no citizen would accept it. In these cases, the authorities sometimes turned to prisoners. A condemned man might be offered his life in exchange for taking up the role, a bargain that traded one form of social death for another. The terms of the position varied, but in many places they were surprisingly formal. The executioner received a salary. In some cities, this salary was substantial, higher than what a common laborer could earn, and sometimes competitive with skilled tradesmen. He might receive a house or at least lodging. He might be exempt from certain taxes. He was entitled to keep specific portions of what the condemned left behind: clothing, small possessions, fees attached to the sentence. In some regions, the executioner also served as the town's torturer when judicial questioning required it, and as a kind of public health officer responsible for removing animal carcasses from the streets, managing lepers, or overseeing other tasks that were considered too unclean for ordinary citizens. These additional duties were not accidental. They reinforced the executioner's place at the margin. He handled what no one else would handle. He touched what no one else would touch. The work itself became a cycle of contamination, each additional duty pushing him further from the center of respectable society. And here was the deepest trap of the role. The salary was real, the house was real, the legal protection was real, but the social cost was absolute. A man who accepted the position of executioner could not leave it behind. Even if he resigned, even if he moved to another town, the stain followed. People talked, records existed, reputation traveled. He could earn a living, but he could never earn respect. That was the bargain. And for many, it was not a bargain they chose freely. It was the only option left. The public square was where the executioner was seen, but the square was only a small part of his life, perhaps the smallest part, measured in hours. The harder part began after the crowd went home. Because unlike a soldier or a judge, the executioner could not leave his work behind. His life outside the scaffold was shaped entirely by what he did inside it. Consider the most basic routines of medieval life, the things that every other citizen took for granted, and imagine how each one changed when the person walking through the door was the executioner. The market. He needed food like anyone else. He needed bread, ale, salt, candles, cloth. But buying these things was not straightforward. In some towns, the executioner was required to wait until other customers had been served before he could approach a stall. In others, he was expected to identify himself, not because merchants did not recognize him, but because the act of identification was part of the ritual of exclusion. He was not an ordinary buyer. He was a different category of person, and the transaction had to reflect that. Some merchants refused to sell to him at all. Others sold, but would not take coins directly from his hand. The money was placed on the counter or in a dish. The merchant picked it up only after the executioner had stepped away. The fear was not rational in the modern sense. It was rooted in a belief, deep, persistent, and nearly universal in medieval culture, that the executioner carried a kind of moral contamination. That proximity to him transferred something unclean. The tavern. A man finishes his work. He wants a drink. He walks into a tavern. In any other case, this is unremarkable. But for the executioner, it was an act that could empty a room. In many towns, if the executioner sat at a table, others would leave. Not always openly, not always rudely, but steadily. The seats around him would remain empty. Conversations nearby would go quiet. If he tried to drink from a communal cup, a common practice in medieval taverns, the cup was considered contaminated. Others would refuse to use it after him. In some documented cases, the cup was broken or discarded. He drank alone, not because he wanted to. The church. Medieval life was organized around faith, and the church was the center of the community. Mass was not optional. It was social, spiritual, and political. Everyone attended. Everyone was seen. The executioner attended too, but his place was marked. In some parishes, he was required to sit in a specific pew, usually at the back, sometimes near the door. He was separated, visibly, deliberately, from the rest of the congregation. The message was clear. He could pray. He could seek God, but he could not do so as an equal. Whether priests treated him with compassion or distance varied. Some records suggest that individual clergymen showed kindness to executioners, visiting them privately or hearing their confessions. Others suggest the opposite, that the church, like the rest of society, kept its distance from a man whose hands were associated with the final act of earthly justice. The fair. Medieval fairs were rare occasions of joy, music, trade, colour, crowds moving freely between stalls, watching performers, sampling goods from distant towns. The executioner could attend, but he did so in a space defined by avoidance. People who recognized him stepped aside. Children who were told who he was stared, then were pulled away by their parents. The fair was a reminder that community existed and that he was not fully part of it. The well. Water was a daily necessity, and in most medieval towns the well was a communal gathering point. Women met there each morning, conversations happened, news was exchanged. The rhythm of the town passed through the well as surely as water passed through the bucket. When the executioner's wife came to draw water, the rhythm changed. Conversation stopped or shifted to whispers. Other women finished quickly and left. The well was still public, it was still shared, but the sharing had a boundary that was invisible and absolute. His home. If the executioner was given a house by the town, it was often located at the edge of the settlement, near the walls, near the river, near the area where other marginal activities took place. The location itself was a message. He was part of the town's apparatus, but not part of its social body. Inside, the house might be modest but functional. He had furniture, tools, a hearth. If he had a wife, she managed the household. If he had children, they grew up within those walls, aware from an early age that the world outside treated their family differently. Neighbors did not visit. Invitations were not extended. The daily exchanges that built community in the medieval world, borrowing flour, sharing news, watching children play together, did not include the executioner's household. The evening. When darkness came and the town settled into quiet, the executioner sat in his home like any other man. A fire in the hearth, a candle on the table, perhaps a meal prepared by his wife, plain food, bread, pottage, whatever the market had been willing to sell him that day. But the silence in this home was different from the silence in other homes. It was not the peaceful quiet of a household at rest. It was the silence of a family surrounded by absence. The absence of visitors, of neighbors, calling out, of the ordinary human traffic that gave a home its place in the world. He may have repaired tools in the evening. He may have sat and stared at the fire. He may have spoken to his wife about the day, or he may have said nothing at all. We do not know. The historical record does not enter the executioner's house at night. It leaves him at the threshold and closes the door. But we know that morning came again. And when it did, the same walk waited, the same market, the same averted eyes, the same empty bench. His wife, if he had one, carried her own burden. She was the executioner's wife. That identity preceded her in every interaction. If she went to the well, other women might fall silent. If she needed help from a neighbor, the help might come reluctantly, or not at all. And the children. The children of the executioner are perhaps the most poignant detail in this entire story. They were born into a stigma they had not chosen and could not escape. Other children were told to avoid them. Other families would not consider them for marriage. The world had already decided what they were before they had done anything at all. A boy growing up in the executioner's house knew, whether anyone said it aloud or not, that his future was limited. The trades were closed to him. The guilds would not accept him. The military might. Soldiers were less particular about origins, but respectable civilian life was largely unavailable. The job followed the executioner home. It sat at his table. It slept under his roof. It lived in the eyes of everyone who looked at his children and saw not a child, but a legacy of contamination. And nowhere was that more visible than in the way the town treated his family. Of everything the executioner endured, the physical duties may have been the least difficult part. The heaviest burden was invisible. It was the weight of being looked at day after day, year after year, with a mixture of fear, disgust, fascination, and something that resembled moral condemnation. The executioner did not choose the sentences. He did not pass judgment. He did not decide who was guilty and who was innocent. That work belonged to the courts, to the judges, to the lords and magistrates who held legal authority. The executioner was the instrument. He carried out what others had decided, and yet in the eyes of the public, the act and the man became inseparable. This is one of the deepest contradictions of medieval justice. The system required the executioner. The law depended on him. Without someone willing to carry out sentences, the entire structure of public justice, The deterrence, the authority, the visible demonstration that the law had consequences would collapse. Everyone understood this. No one questioned the necessity. But the man who fulfilled that necessity was treated as though he had volunteered for sin. He likely learned to hide emotion early. The role demanded distance from the crowd, from the condemned, from his own reactions. Whether he believed in the justice he carried out or not, the crowd rarely cared. They saw the act and projected onto the man whatever they needed to feel: righteousness, revulsion, morbid curiosity, or the relief that it was someone else standing there and not them. The psychological architecture of this arrangement was remarkable in its cruelty. Society created the role. Society filled the role. Society demanded that the role be performed. And then society punished the man who performed it, as though he had imposed himself upon an unwilling world. He could never be ordinary again. The moment a man accepted the office, he crossed a threshold that had no return. Every interaction from that point forward was filtered through the knowledge of what he did. Every handshake was hesitant. Every greeting was measured. Every silence in a room when he entered was a verdict, repeated without words, hundreds of times a year. The isolation was not simply social, it was existential. A blacksmith, at the end of his day, went home as a man who shaped iron. A baker went home as a man who made bread. A physician went home as a man who tried to heal. The executioner went home as the executioner. The identity consumed everything else about him. Whatever he had been before, whatever skills he possessed, whatever kindness he might have shown, whatever thoughts occupied his mind during the long evenings alone, none of it mattered to the world outside his door. He was defined by a single function, and that function defined the whole of his existence. The loneliness of this position is difficult to overstate. He could not confide in neighbors. He had no colleagues in the usual sense. There was typically only one executioner per town. He could not discuss his inner life with people who would not sit beside him in a tavern. If he married, his wife shared the isolation, but may not have shared the full weight of what the role demanded internally. The emotional distance required to perform the duties, the controlled detachment, the suppression of visible reaction, the steady public composure, was a skill. But like any skill maintained under pressure, it came at a cost. The effort of appearing unmoved day after day in front of crowds that watched for any sign of weakness or hesitation must have been a profound form of psychological labor. Whether this man lay awake at night, whether he questioned the justice of what he did, whether he found peace in prayer or in silence or in nothing at all, these are questions the historical record mostly does not answer. Executioners did not write memoirs in the Middle Ages. Their inner worlds are largely invisible. One notable exception came later. Meister Franz Schmidt, the executioner of Nuremberg in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, kept a diary. In it, he recorded hundreds of cases over a career spanning more than 4 decades. The entries are terse, factual, almost bureaucratic. Names, dates, offences, sentences carried out. What the diary does not contain is equally significant. Almost no emotion. Almost no reflection, almost no mention of the weight that each entry must have carried. Was this restraint deliberate? Was it a survival mechanism, the habit of a man who had learned to record without feeling, to document without processing? Or was it simply the style of the era, a man writing as men of his time wrote, without the vocabulary of introspection that later centuries would develop? We do not know, but the diary exists, and in its careful, flat precision, it tells us something that emotion might have obscured: the relentlessness of the work, entry after entry, year after year, the same office, the same duty, the same public role, repeated until it became the entire shape of a life. But we can infer certain things from the conditions of their lives. A man who is shunned by his community will seek meaning elsewhere. In faith, perhaps. In family, if he has one. In routine and discipline. In the small private world of his own home, where at least the walls do not recoil. A man who carries public blame for actions demanded by the state will develop strategies for survival, emotional armor as heavy as any chainmail, built not from iron but from habit, from distance, from the careful suppression of the self. The job ended in the square. The stigma did not. It followed him to the market, to the church, to the well, to his own doorstep. It followed him into sleep, into silence, into every moment when the world reminded him that he was different, necessary, but different, needed, but never welcome. And the most painful version of this truth was not in the avoidance of strangers, it was in the eyes of his own children. So far, we have looked at the executioner from the inside, his daily life, his isolation, his psychological burden. Now let us turn the perspective outward. Because the executioner did not exist in a vacuum, he existed inside a web of public perception that was as complex and contradictory as medieval society itself. To understand how the crowd saw the executioner, you have to understand that medieval people did not separate a man from his function the way modern people try to. There was no concept of leaving work at the office. A man was his trade. A blacksmith was a blacksmith at the forge and at the dinner table. A priest was a priest in the church and in the street. The executioner was the executioner everywhere, always, in every context. And the reactions he provoked were layered, contradictory, and deeply revealing, not just of how people felt about him, but of how they felt about themselves. The crowd feared him. This was the most basic and most universal reaction. The executioner was associated with the finality of justice. His presence meant that something irreversible was about to happen, or had already happened. For ordinary people, seeing the executioner walk through town was a reminder that the law had teeth, and that those teeth could close on anyone. The fear was not limited to the moment of public justice. It extended into daily life. Parents told children to stay away from the executioner's house. Merchants believed that his touch could spoil goods. In some regions, popular belief held that the executioner possessed a kind of dark power, that objects he had touched carried residual energy, that his gaze could bring misfortune, that his shadow on a threshold was an omen. These beliefs were not marginal superstitions. They were woven into the fabric of everyday medieval thought. In a world where the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural were porous, the executioner occupied a space that was both civic and almost mystical. He was the man who stood at the border between life and its end, and borders, in the medieval imagination, were dangerous places. The crowd despised him. Not all fear came with respect. Much of it came with contempt. The executioner was placed among the lowest social categories alongside tanners, gravediggers, and others who dealt with what society considered impure. The contempt was moral as much as practical. People looked at the executioner and saw a man who did what no decent person would do. The fact that the law required it, the fact that judges ordered it, the fact that the crowd itself attended, None of this softened the moral judgment against the individual who performed the act. This is one of the great hypocrisies that the executioner's existence exposed. Medieval public justice was a spectacle. It was designed to be witnessed. The square was chosen precisely because it was public. The crowd gathered not because they were forced to attend, but because they came willingly, drawn by a mixture of civic obligation, moral certainty, morbid curiosity, and something harder to name. They watched, they stared. Some cheered, some prayed, some brought their children so that the children would learn what happened to those who broke the law. And then they went home and condemned the man who had stood at the center of what they had just watched. The paradox was absolute. The same society that demanded public justice recoiled from the man who delivered it. The same crowd that filled the square turned its back on the executioner the moment he stepped down from the platform. He was useful in the square. He was untouchable outside it. The crowd was fascinated by him. Beneath the fear and the contempt, there was something else. Curiosity. A dark, persistent interest in the man who held an authority that no one else possessed. People whispered about him. They speculated about his habits, his thoughts, his home life. They invented stories. They attributed to him qualities, coldness, cruelty, supernatural calm that may or may not have reflected reality. This fascination was not kind. It was the fascination of people looking at something they had decided was fundamentally other. The executioner was a figure of projection. The crowd placed onto him whatever they could not accept in themselves. The capacity for violence, the complicity in punishment, the willingness to stand in the uncomfortable space between law and morality. In this way, the executioner served a psychological function that went far beyond his civic role. He was the container for society's discomfort. He absorbed the moral cost of collective justice, allowing everyone else to walk away with clean hands. And yet, some people respected him. Not openly, not warmly, but a quiet, grudging respect existed in certain corners of medieval society. The executioner's skill was recognized, not as something admirable, but as something real. A man who performed his duties competently, without unnecessary suffering, without error, without public failure, earned a reputation that had its own weight. Town councils valued a reliable executioner. They paid him, housed him, and protected him legally, not out of affection, but out of practical necessity. A town without a competent executioner was a town whose justice system could be embarrassed, and embarrassment in public justice carried political consequences. There was even a strange form of celebrity attached to the role. In larger cities, the executioner was known by name. People spoke of him as they might speak of any prominent figure, with a mixture of recognition and unease. His reputation preceded him. When a new executioner was appointed, the town took note. When an old one died, the town took note of that too. He was invisible in social terms, but entirely visible in civic terms. The executioner existed at the intersection of all these reactions: fear, contempt, fascination, reluctant respect. He was never seen as simply a man. He was always seen through the lens of his function, distorted by the needs and anxieties of a society that had created his role and then refused to accept him as part of itself. Everyone knew who he was. That was his burden. The executioner's work in the square was not private. It was, by design, the most public act in the life of a medieval town. And with that publicity came pressure. Enormous, unforgiving, and deeply personal pressure. The crowd expected competence, the authorities demanded it. The condemned if such a word can capture the full horror of the situation, depended on it. Because in an era when public justice was carried out physically, the difference between a skilled executioner and an unskilled one was the difference between a task performed with control and a task that descended into chaos. The executioner knew this. He knew that every moment in the square was watched by hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. He knew that the crowd judged not only the sentence, but the manner of its execution. He knew that a failure, a hesitation, a misstep, a loss of composure would be remembered and talked about for weeks, for months, perhaps for the rest of his career. And the consequences of failure were real. Historical records document cases where executioners who failed in their duties were attacked by the crowd. Mobs turned on the executioner himself, not out of sympathy for the condemned, but out of rage at the spectacle gone wrong. In some instances, the executioner was beaten. In extreme cases, his own life was placed in danger by the crowd that had come to watch him work. This created a paradox of performance that defined the executioner's professional life. He needed to be precise, controlled, composed. He needed to project authority and certainty in a moment of extraordinary tension. And he needed to do all of this while carrying the knowledge that the same crowd watching him with rapt attention would avoid him in the street the next morning. The training for this role was informal, passed from father to son in many cases, or learned through a period of apprenticeship under an existing executioner. There were no manuals, no academies. The knowledge was practical, physical, and deeply experiential. A young man learning the trade learned it by observation, by assisting, and eventually by doing. The executioner also served in many towns as the person responsible for administering judicial questioning under duress. This added another layer of skill to the role, the ability to extract information under the supervision of magistrates, following specific legal protocols that varied by jurisdiction. The process was governed by rules, witnessed by officials, and documented in records. It was not uncontrolled, but it was the executioner who performed it, adding another dimension to the contamination that followed him. Beyond these primary duties, the executioner in many regions was expected to possess knowledge of the human body that overlapped with medicine. In parts of Germany, executioners were known to set bones, treat dislocations, and prepare herbal remedies. Some became sought-after healers, a deeply ironic role for a man otherwise associated with the opposite of healing. People who would not sit beside him in church would come to his door at night asking for a salve, a poultice, a remedy for pain. This dual identity, healer and executor of justice, added complexity to an already impossible social position. He was feared for one role and needed for another, rejected in daylight and consulted in shadow. The professional dimension of the executioner's life was defined by a single, relentless truth. Perfection was expected, and gratitude was never given. He performed a duty that required nerve, precision, knowledge, and composure under extreme public scrutiny. He did it repeatedly, over the course of years or decades. He bore the consequences of each performance, the physical toll, the emotional cost, the social repercussions. And when it was done well, no one thanked him. When it was done poorly, everyone remembered. The executioner stood at the center of a public stage he had not designed, performing a role he could not reshape, for an audience that would judge him harshly regardless of the outcome. The square was his workplace, his theater, and his trial, all at once. And When the crowd dispersed, when the square emptied and the officials returned to their chambers, the executioner walked home, through the same streets, past the same faces, back to the same house at the edge of town. The silence that greeted him there was the sound of a society that had used him and was finished. Until the next time. Perhaps the cruelest dimension of the executioner's life was not what it did to him. It was what it did to the people who shared his name. We have already seen that the executioner's children were born into stigma. But the full weight of that inheritance deserves to be examined more closely, because it reveals something fundamental about how medieval society understood identity, not as something you built, but as something you inherited, carried, and could never fully set down. The executioner's son did not choose his father's profession. He did not choose to live in the house at the edge of town. He did not choose to carry the name that made other families pull their children indoors when he walked past. But the name carried him. In the guild system that governed most skilled trades in medieval Europe, membership was essential. Without guild membership, a man could not practice a trade in most towns. And guild membership was not merely professional, it was social. Guilds had standards of honor. They required that members come from reputable families, families without the taint of dishonorable work. The executioner's son failed this test before he could take it. Tanning, butchering, grave digging, and executing justice. These occupations left a mark that guilds refused to overlook. The son of an executioner presenting himself to a guild would be turned away, not because of his skills, not because of his character, because of his blood. This meant that the trades available to the executioner's children were the same marginal trades that society grouped together at the bottom of the social hierarchy. If the son could not enter a guild, he could not become a baker, a carpenter, a weaver, or a goldsmith. The doors that were open led to the same margins his father already occupied. Marriage was equally constrained. A family considering a match for their daughter would investigate the suitor's background. Reputation was currency. Honor was capital. A family that married their daughter to the son of an executioner accepted the contamination for themselves. Their other children's prospects would be diminished. Their standing in the community would be questioned. Most families were unwilling to make this trade. The executioner's son, therefore, married within his own social sphere. Other executioner families, other dishonorable trades, other people who had already been placed outside the circle of respectability. This created the dynastic pattern we discussed earlier, not because executioner families loved their profession, but because the profession was the only world that would have them. The daughters faced a parallel constraint. An executioner's daughter was a difficult match, unless she married into another executioner family or a family already at the margins. Her father's identity would follow her into her new household. And the name itself could carry weight across generations. In some regions, the family of a former executioner continued to bear the stigma long after the last member of the family had held the position. A grandson, a great-grandson, men who had never seen the inside of the public square except as bystanders, could still be refused guild membership, still be identified by the whispered knowledge that their ancestor had held the office. The family lived in a house that was known, the house at the edge of town, the house that neighbors passed without stopping, the house where no one came for dinner and no one lingered for conversation. Inside that house, a family existed. They ate together. They raised children. They experienced the ordinary rhythms of life, births, illnesses, seasons, loss. but they experienced all of it inside a container shaped by exclusion. The walls of the house were not just stone and timber. They were the boundary between a family and a world that had decided, before any of them were born, that they did not belong. The executioner came home each evening to faces that understood what he carried. His wife understood. His children understood, even before they could articulate it. The silence at the dinner table was not the comfortable silence of a family at peace. It was the silence of people who knew that the world outside their door had drawn a line around them, and that nothing they did would erase it. And yet, despite everything, these families endured. They continued. They raised children and buried parents. They observed holy days and weathered hard winters. They lived fully, humanly, within a space that the rest of the world had decided was beneath notice. There is something quietly extraordinary in that endurance, not heroic in the dramatic sense, not defiant in any visible way, just the steady, unremarkable persistence of people who kept going because the alternative was to stop existing entirely. The profession marked generations. It was not just a job, it was a sentence, passed not by a court, but by the quiet, relentless judgment of an entire society. Medieval people feared the executioner as if he was separate from society, but he was not separate. He was produced by it. Every town that appointed an executioner made a choice. Every court that passed a sentence relied on him. Every crowd that gathered in the square depended on his presence. The entire architecture of public justice, from the judge's bench to the last row of spectators, was built on the assumption that one man would stand where no one else would stand and do what no one else would do. And then that same society turned its back on him. It refused to eat with him. It refused to let his children learn a trade. It refused to sit beside him in church. It refused to touch the cup he drank from. It created a man it needed and then punished him for existing. The executioner did not fall from grace. He was placed beneath it deliberately by a system that required someone to absorb the moral cost of its own decisions. He carried out what others demanded. Then he lived with the stain of it alone. In the end, the darkest part of the executioner's life was not the duty itself. It was the silence afterward, the walk home through streets where no one met his eye, the empty bench in the tavern, the closed doors, the children who were taught to fear him before they understood why. He was not a monster. He was not a villain. He was a man doing a job that no one wanted done, but everyone required, and paying for it every day with the one thing no salary could replace: a place in the world. You think the darkest part of this job was what he did in public. It was what he had to live with afterward. Thank you so much for watching. If you value this kind of deep historical reconstruction, please subscribe to Walter Reconstructs History. I make videos that bring lost worlds, forgotten lives, and great turning points back to life in a way that is simple, visual, and grounded in real history. And if there is another forgotten life, another vanished role, or another hidden world you want to see reconstructed, leave it in the comments. What should I reconstruct next on Walter Reconstructs History?